Hiya, my name is Ella Radley, and today I'm going to be exploring how Porcelain Breaks, my product that was also created by Max Rose, Laura Timpson and Frankie DeBradney, uses or challenges conventions and how it represents social groups and ideologies. So firstly, I'm going to explain to you what typical horror conventions are that are used in many of the huge conglomerate films created by Disney Studios or 21st Century Fox. So normally in horror films, they use knives, they use blood, they use darkness, and especially isolation and abandonment, because they want that typical protagonist to feel victimized, to feel weak. And they also use shadows and kind of hidden faces, because as the plot continues, it's kind of, as a Roland Barthes would say, a hermeneutic code. You don't know what the film is trying to denote to you. And also death is very typical, because in like action and thriller films, obviously they use death. But in horror, the deaths are so repetitive that it kind of shows that even innocent people are able to be killed by the antagonist. Okay, so what does conventions mean? So a convention is a repeated element that reoccurs throughout a media text by using codes that have slowly over time been accepted by audiences. So here you can see in relation to Porcelain Breaks, so we've used the mise-en-scène of the kind of the red makeup in order to bring out the victim's eyes. We've used the Victorian blue dresses that are identical due to there being monozygotic twins. And we've also used that dioptic lens to capture the brightness and scary doll aesthetic. So next, so I'm going to explore how Porcelain Breaks compares to 3 different types of horror genre films. These are very unique films and they're not typical, but I thought because they were so different, it would be more exciting to compare them to. So we've got, firstly, The Haunting of Molly Bannister by M.J. Dixon and was released on the 22nd of June 2020. We have The Curse of Robert by Andrew Jones on the 12th of September 2016. And we also have Devil Doll by Lindsay Shonteff, September 1964. But before I start to compare these to Porcelain Breaks, I'm going to show you what Porcelain Breaks looks like and how it took us a long time, but we eventually got there. So that was Porcelain Breaks. So my first comparison that I'm going to be looking at is The Haunting of Molly Bannister. So I'm just going to move myself across there. So in comparison to Porcelain Breaks, Molly Bannister uses many long takes and shots. So we use kind of a more like fast-paced shots because we want to show the different types of typical horror doll conventions that are used within the doll's house. because in the Molly Bannister film, they wanted to note the lengthy tension and suspense made before her equilibrium is disrupted. They also use the chiaroscuro lighting, where the shadows are reflected behind the camera, and the range of dark colours. So typically in horror films, they use kind of red in order to represent and connote blood. They use kind of black as a sense of macabre and death. As well as this, they used thematic and synchronous music, which we used to help draw the attention to the horror genre, making the audience's heart start racing. So typically in horror genre films, the whole reason why there's a lot of death and a lot of disruption to the innocence of victims is because they want people to feel more engaged in the film and the target demographics to keep watching in order to reach the end of the film. They use a shallow focus shot, as you can see here, where there's the doll kind of in the background and it's kind of blurred at the top of the screen, meaning many antagonists can't be seen. So it's kind of like hiding the victim's face, as I said before. Okay, so next I'm going to explore the Curse of Robert. So they used a repetition of short takes, which is similar to Porcelain Breaks, and it shows kind of how the fast-paced film generates this nervous tension. They also used high key lighting, which we used at the beginning to kind of show how they're like the psycho twins, but in reality they might seem as if they're innocent, but they're actually psychotic. In The Curse of Robert, the high key lighting, which is portrayed on the doll, makes his eyes look frightening and distorted, as well as the knife used to connote macabre to many of the innocent people. As well as this, which is very similar to Porcelain Breaks, there's a comparison between the pleonastic sound of people's screams and silence, which is very unsettling and a very powerful horror convention, which is what we used in our opening sequence. Then they used a deep focus shot and a pan denoting the porcelain dolls and establishing kind of that unique setting and making that feeling of uncomfort for the target demographic. Okay, finally, we have the Devil Doll. So, in the kind of, because it was produced in 1964, they didn't have the typical technological convergence that we have nowadays. So they didn't have the dioptic lens that we were able to use and the different colours that were able to be denoted. So they had to use kind of the cameras which only show kind of like that glitchy and that grey footage. However, they used voiceovers, which we didn't use, and it helped to direct the narrative more clearly to the elder generations and what the intentions of the horror film are, which is extremely effective. They use many close-ups of the dummy's face, which acts as an enigma code towards viewers, as they realise that the prop isn't just a toy, but acts as an antagonist throughout. Within our film, we used, so Laurel Timpson, she was amazing. She helped us to create this ribbon font, which helped to relate to the typical kind of bows that they wear in their hair, so relating to the mise en scène. However, Devil Doll used the serif font in order to denote professionalism as a part of the film industry. And finally, a typical editing technique which was used by many doll horror genre films was the blink of an eye, which covers the entirety of the footage, suggesting that the whole film is kind of from the doll's perspective, as if they are the main narrator. Next, I'm going to be looking at a different opening sequence, which is Spectre, one of the main James Bond films created by a very famous conglomerate. And we're kind of going to be exploring the differences between the Porcelain Breaks opening sequence and the Spectre opening sequence, seeing as Spectre is an action and thriller genre film. So at the beginning, they use an establishing shot of the city, and then they switch to a close-up of the aircraft. And this is a really important denotation because it explores that Bond is going to be involved in many dangerous activities, seeing as he is a spy. They also use a racking focus and an extreme close-up of the ring, which helps to symbolise kind of and foreshadow the terrorist organisation that acts as an antagonist, which is going to try to take down James Bond, the protagonist in the film. As well as this, we couldn't use this because we'd only just started learning how to use the camera, the composition, and the editing. But due to them being in the huge film industry, they could create graphic match cuts, which portray a smooth transition between two scenes with similar visuals. And finally, the Enigma code of the symbol of the Spectre is a repeating code that comes throughout. So this relates to Stuart Hall's representation theory. and helps to make the target audience aware that this terrorist organization is seen as someone that opposes James Bond. So it's that kind of binary opposition between good versus evil. Finally, we have a few more conventions here. As you can see throughout the images that I've included, you've kind of got the typical eyes going over each other, the glass, the flames, and the sea visuals. So due to the lighting being chiaroscuro, it shows that we can see that she's kind of bare. So you can see how her body is kind of in black, but the lighting in the background is kind of like bright. And this relates to Laura Mulvey's theory of the male gaze. So she believed in Hollywood kind of in the 1900s, like 20th century. She explored how in Hollywood many of the audiences were typically of the male, so they were able to gain pleasure through watching the female, and due to them being very voyeuristic and fetishistic, it was hard for them to be seen as anything else than just a victim in the typical film. Also, they used the action match cuts, which successfully transitioned from the shards of glass into people's faces. Also, in James Bond's opening sequence, so you wouldn't see this a lot, but they decided to use sea creature visuals that wrap themselves around the victim, suggesting that those that he loves, he always loses, because he has to try and fight the antagonist to save the main dominant ideology, and unfortunately that one person from the minority who he cares about massively is going to die. And then we have the flame graphic match cut into the old photos, suggesting that anything in James Bond's past doesn't matter to him anymore. He constantly is looking into the future and seeing how he's going to save the next victims. And then they use superimposed text, which is what we use in Porcelain Breaks, and it places itself over different people's eyes, and it helps to relate to the quote, "How eyes are the windows to the soul," which is very powerful. Okay, so now I'm going to be exploring how our product challenges the typical horror conventions. So within a horror genre, the antagonists are normally of the male stereotype and normally elder to create a repetitive code that target audiences can relate to. Again, relating to kind of Roland Barthes' theory of those proerotic codes, and also Stuart Hall's repetitions and differences. However, we decided to use female twins due to them being identical, and also because they were younger, in order to generate distortion and nerve-breaking graphics. So something that they can't normally relate to, but kind of creates a sense of superiority that the females are starting to have over the males. Also, they normally use low-key lighting and shadows in horror genres, but we wanted to use that high-key lighting with how we denoted the fake kind of innocence that twins portray at the beginning, and then this massively opposes at the end, and we see that they are actually psychotic when they break the doll's head. We also included makeup that was pale and porcelain to match the mise-en-scène for our theme. However, we used access eyeshadow, which isn't normally quite typical. They normally use kind of only like little bits of makeup or like winged eyeliner. But we wanted to bring out the doll actress's eyes and help to create her like a threat to the audience. So now I'm going to see how the social groups are present within our opening sequence. So one of the main social groups that relates to Porcelain Breaks is the female. So they're more likely to watch our film because the entire theme is related to the horror dollhouse. This is a stereotypical toy used by females in the Victorian era. So normally boys would be playing sport. This is just stereotypical. And girls would be playing with toys or with the mothers in the house. As well as this, it relates to the dresses used for the Psycho Twins costumes, were extremely kind of feminine, floral, and decorative, meaning that the girls that are watching it may be attracted and more engaged and then want to relate to their clothing and change their style. Another social group is teenagers, aged 15 to 16. So the different types of enigma codes, such as the harsh scream conveyed by the survival doll, the hyperventilating, which is that kind of diegetic sound, the tied up wrists, and the incorporation of green low-key lighting, would relate more to teenagers rather than younger children, because it would be kind of too scary and kind of off-putting, which could really start causing nightmares or something. And finally, the last group is the upper class. So the girls playing with the dolls can have continuous wealth opportunities, being able to have a large dollhouse where they're entertained, rather than jobs in the working class of the Victorian era. Okay, so now I'm going to see how editing was used in order to relate to these different social issues. So the different types of editing techniques that we wanted to incorporate was the repetitive cuts to represent the fast-paced element of our opening sequence. And also in the horror genre, they use short takes to build up the tension that the target demographic can start feeling and the suspense. We also wanted some of our shots to evidently fade into each other so that we could see that the narrative was very smooth flowing. We know that the plot's going to start gradually increasing in tension. The first minute with the Psycho twins playing with the dollhouse and then the dolls coming to life, but suddenly it tends to switch between reality and then to the toy dolls to make the audience kind of feel concerned about what is actually happening, and kind of that whole idea of distortion and confusion. Also, we created our own font, as I've said before, with the ribbon design. So this was kind of more of a sans serif font instead of a serif font. But we wanted to include also a non-copyright creepy doll soundtrack to bring the storyline to life. So this was asynchronous. Okay, and then we've got camera work and camera composition and how this relates to the social issues. So we used, firstly, these extreme close-ups in order to establish the fear in the doll's eyes, and the dioptic lens, which we had to place on top of the normal camera lens, which meant that we could zoom in more enhanced onto the doll's features. We also tried to use a racking focus to show that shift in focus between the shallow focus and the deep focus shot within the doll's house, so highlighting the features maybe in the background a bit more or more in the front. We used a wide shot as well to incorporate the setting of the Victorian hallway to show the wealth of the upper class girls and the psychotic twins as the main subjects. Finally, we used a high angle to diminish the doll's power, as she had been destroyed by the antagonist of the psychotic twin. Then, here, as you can see some pictures, we've got the mise en scène. So you can see the doll's costumes, in the left-hand corner, the doll's house, the Titan LED tube, that red, really powerful lipstick, the green lighting, and those little kind of mugs which were used. So the lighting that we used was the Titan LED tube. So within the dolls section, we used that kind of low key with a green colour to show that villainous side from the promoted by the Psycho twins. However, we used a warm yellow to promote the innocence, which became at the beginning of the opening sequence to kind of show that opposition between the two. The costumes and props we used was the Amazon in order to have the twins' Victorian dresses and the dolls' red and white costumes. So the typical Victorian twins normally have very kind of floral and stylish dresses, but the dolls also relate massively to this. So they have the ribbons in their hair, they have the porcelain makeup. So eBay was one of our main supporter for the toy dolls outfits and also for the interior of the doll's house. And then the cast members. I think this is extremely important, as I said before, stereotypically they normally use the male, but we included two monozygotic twins to relate to the horror genre. For example, in The Shining, they used two identical twins to create that nervous tension. We used Lucy Higginbotham, who, as you can see here in the red dress, she had red curly hair, which is very unique and not typical in the horror film. So she has a perfect kind of bone structure to act like a doll. And Ness Hawkins in the white dress has superb theatrical skills. So when she was having to hyperventilate, she could exaggerate this so it seemed as more pleonastic sound. Next, we have got sound. So we decided to use diegetic sound of the real dolls hyperventilating to highlight their fear and show how their equilibrium was massively being disrupted and making them feel very uncomfortable, generating that fear in a more enhanced way. As well as this, when Lucy screams, it's a very pleonastic sound, it's a high-pitched, it's a long take, and it's uncomfortable for that audience, showing that the uncomfort that they can then relate to. Lastly, there was a non-diegetic and asynchronous music that was non-copyrighted in order to relate to the horror genre. So you can hear kind of the beat and the tempo, which increases slowly and then rapidly and then even more quickly as the tension builds and as we see the dolls being killed by the Psycho twins. And it's more visually enticing and engaging for that target demographic. Okay, so I'm coming to the end of my presentation, but overall it's evident that Porcelain Breaks has brought kind of those typical horror conventions related to those social groups and issues in society and has brought, as Roland Barthes would say, those enigma codes to life. I believe that we should have won an Media Award, if I'm going to be honest, but we were very, very proud of our nomination for the Teacher's Fest opening sequence. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed watching Porcelain Breaks. Thank you.